The edge of the obsidian cliffs wasn't just a drop. It was a hungry, vertical grave. Below, the mist didn't just swirl. It hissed with the suffocating, unnatural cold of the forbidden territory, the domain of the creatures that wolves only spoke of in whispered, trembling warnings. At the precipice, Isabel struggled, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. Her wrists were raw, chafed by the iron-wrought rope that bound her hands behind her back. Before her stood Silas, the man who, until an hour ago, had been her mate. The man who had once promised to protect her, now stood with a cruel, satisfied sneer, his eyes devoid of even a flicker of the love he had once claimed to harbor. "You were always a mistake, Isabel," Silas spat, his voice echoing against the jagged rocks. "A pathetic, weak wolf who brought nothing but shame to our pack. The elders have decided. The Vampire King doesn't accept tribute, but he does accept trash. Consider yourself erased." With a brutal shove, he sent her spiraling into the abyss. As she fell, the wind tore a silent scream from her lungs, and she braced for the impact of the cold, dark death that waited below. But the earth didn't shatter her. The darkness reached out not to kill but to catch. "Hello, my wonderful story-loving family. It is so incredibly good to have you here with me today. Before we plummet into the shadows of the Vampire King's domain and uncover the secret that could tear two worlds apart, I want to ask, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Also, if you're enjoying this intense, emotional roller coaster and you haven't yet, please take a quick moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. It is the absolute best way to support the channel and ensures you never miss a single chapter of our epic journeys. Are you ready for a story about betrayal, ancient power, and a survival story that will change history? Let's dive into the dark together. Isabel hit the ground, not with the sickening crunch of breaking bones, but with a strange, dampened thud. She lay in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was alive. But as the shadows began to coalesce around her, she realized she hadn't landed in a grave. She was in a vaulted Gothic hall where the air tasted of ancient stone and blood-drenched history. She was in the Vampire King's den. From the darkness at the far end of the hall, a figure emerged. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace, not walking but gliding. This was Victor, the King of the Night, the creature of nightmares who hadn't walked among the living for a century. He stopped just inches from her, his presence so heavy it made the very air feel like oil. Isabel braced for the strike, for the fangs, for the end. But Victor didn't strike. He leaned in, his skin cold as winter frost, and his eyes, a piercing, unnatural crimson, widened as he inhaled the scent of her fear. Then he did the unthinkable. He recoiled, his hand trembling as he reached toward her, not to rip but to marvel. "That scent," he whispered, his voice like the grinding of ancient stone. "It hasn't been breathed in this hall for 1,000 years. Who, or what are you?" Isabel, shivering and broken, stared up at the man who was supposed to be her executioner. She didn't know it yet, but the blood running through her veins was the key to a forgotten prophecy, a power that had terrified the Vampire King into isolation. Silas had tried to throw her away, but he had accidentally delivered the most dangerous weapon in the supernatural world right into the enemy's arms. The question remained. Now that she was here, would Victor be her destroyer, or would he become the guardian of the woman his kind was destined to fear? The great hall of the Citadel of Shadows was cold enough to turn breath into crystal, yet Isabel felt a feverish, pulsing heat beneath her skin. She was Isabel Vane, a woman born into a pack that valued only the predatory weight of an alpha's bite. Her entire life had been a series of subtractions. First, her parents were lost to the border wars. Then her rank was stripped away by the council. And finally, her heart was discarded by Silas Thorne, the man she had mistakenly bonded with in a desperate bid for security. Silas was everything Isabel was not: brutal, calculating, and obsessed with the social hierarchy of the wolves. He had chosen her originally for her beauty, but when she didn't manifest the aggressive, violent spirit the pack demanded, he saw her as a defect. He had used her softness as a weapon against her, framing her kindness as weakness and her empathy as treason. Isabel sat on the floor of the citadel, her back against a pillar carved with the weeping faces of ancestors she didn't know. Her deepest fear wasn't the monster who had brought her here. It was the realization that she had been hollow all along. She had spent so long trying to be the wolf Silas wanted that she had forgotten how to exist as herself. Victor Draven, the vampire king, watched her from the shadows. He was a creature of refined, aristocratic cruelty, a man who had seen the rise and fall of empires from the quiet, velvet-lined darkness of his throne. He was immortal, bored, and profoundly lonely. His existence was a cage of his own making, defined by the thirst for blood and the burden of guarding a secret he had been tasked to protect since the dawn of his kind. "You are not shivering from the cold," Victor noted, his voice smooth as polished obsidian. He emerged into the dim light. He wore a high-collared coat of dark silk, and his features were as sharp and unforgiving as a winter blade. "You are shivering because your blood is fighting itself. It remembers something your mind has been trained to suppress." Isabel stood, her legs shaky but her chin lifted. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a broken wolf, King. A piece of trash, according to my mate." Victor's crimson eyes narrowed. He crossed the distance between them in a blink, his fingers, cold, long and elegant, grazing the pulse point on her neck. He didn't bite. He simply touched her, and Isabel felt a surge of ancient, static electricity. "Your mate is a fool who tosses diamonds into the mud because he prefers the taste of dirt," Victor murmured, a flicker of something almost like pity crossing his features. "Your blood carries the echo of the Lumina, the ancestral line that forged the first truce between our kind and yours. It is a power that can heal or it can burn. Your people didn't want you because you are not a weapon. You are a bridge." Suddenly, the great doors of the hall shuddered. A familiar, arrogant scent drifted into the room, the musk of pine and stale aggression. Silas. He had followed her. He hadn't trusted the cliff to finish the job. He wanted to see her corpse, or perhaps he wanted the satisfaction of finishing her himself. Isabel felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fear. Silas was a high-ranking beta, backed by a squadron of pack enforcers. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes wide. "He's come to finish it." Victor turned toward the doors, his expression shifting from detached curiosity to a predatory, lethal focus. He didn't look like a bored king anymore. He looked like a storm front. "Let him come," Victor replied, a dark, thin smile playing on his lips. "I have not had a reason to remind the wolves of their place in a very long time. And I have never had a reason to defend a guest." Isabel looked at the king, the man who was supposed to be the villain of every story she'd ever been told, and felt a strange, jarring connection. She realized then that her life with Silas was a lie built on cruelty, and her life in the shadows was a truth she hadn't yet learned to read. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice steadying. Victor looked at her, and for a fleeting second the monster vanished. "Because, Isabel, the moment you hit that floor I realized that for the first time in an eternity, I don't want to be alone in the dark." The doors exploded inward, and Silas stood framed in the moonlight, his fangs bared, his eyes glowing with the killing intent of a man who had found his prey. The battle for Isabel's soul had begun, and the choice she made in the next few minutes would decide the fate of both their kingdoms. The shattered remains of the great oak doors rained down like jagged confetti. Silas Thorne stepped into the hall, his boots crunching against the splinters with a rhythmic, arrogant precision. Behind him, a dozen elite pack warriors, the blood-bound, poured in like a tide of snarling, fur-covered rage. They were the muscle of the pack, the ones who had laughed when Silas cast Isabel over the cliff. "Victor Draven." Silas roared, his voice tearing through the stillness. He didn't look at Isabel at first. He scanned the room for a trophy, a body to drag back to the council. "The pact of the forbidden territory is clear. No wolf enters, no vampire leaves. You have broken the peace by harboring this traitor." Isabel felt the air in the hall thicken. The temperature plummeted until her breath came out in visible, ghostly plumes. She watched, heart-pounding, as Victor slowly descended the dais. He didn't look like a king under siege. He looked like a predator who had finally been invited to a feast. "Peace." Victor's voice was a silky, dangerous hum. "You speak of peace, little wolf, while you hunt your own kind for the crime of being, what? Inconvenient? Isabel is not a traitor. She is a guest. She is a defect." Silas snapped, finally locking eyes with Isabel. His gaze wasn't filled with regret or even cold calculation. It was pure, visceral hate. She was a failed experiment of our lineage. A weak, soft-hearted stain on our pack's honor. I gave her a merciful death. If you want to keep her as a corpse. Silas lunged. It was a blur of speed that even Isabel's wolf-enhanced eyes struggled to track. He was a master of the hunt, his claws extended, aiming directly for Victor's throat. But he wasn't fast enough. Victor didn't draw a sword. He simply caught Silas's wrist midair with one hand, the sound of bones shifting under the pressure echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Then, with a casual, sickening flick of his fingers, he sent the beta flying 20 feet backward, where he slammed into a pillar. You speak of honor, Victor said, his crimson eyes glowing with a terrifying ancient light. Yet you bring an army to a house of shadows to finish a job you couldn't do yourself. Is this what the wolves have become? Cowards. The blood-bound pack warriors, sensing the shift in the balance of power, hesitated. They knew the legends of the Vampire King, how he had ended the last great war with a single night of fire. Attack him! Silas screamed, scrambling up from the floor, his face a mask of blood and humiliation. Kill them both. The pack rewards the one who brings me the girl's heart. Isabel moved before she knew what she was doing. She didn't have a weapon, but she felt a strange, humming vibration in her blood, a heat that radiated from her chest to her fingertips. She stepped between Victor and the lead enforcer, her eyes wide, her hands outstretched. Stop, she cried. The word carried a weight she didn't understand. It wasn't just a plea, it was a command. A ripple of golden light flared from her palms, slamming into the advancing wolves like a physical wall of force. The pack warriors skidded to a halt, whining as if struck by a lightning rod. The hall went deathly silent. Victor stared at Isabel, his composure shattered. He had sensed the potential in her, but he hadn't believed it until he saw it. The Lumina light, the power of the ancient mediators, hadn't been seen in a millennium. Silas stared at her, his jaw dropping. What did you do? You're a weakling. You have no magic. I am what you made me, Isabel said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every syllable. I am the woman you tried to kill, Silas. And I am the woman you should have feared. The inciting incident had passed the point of no return. The wolves were terrified, the king was transfixed, and Isabel had revealed a power that made her the most dangerous person in the room. But Silas, driven by a desperate pathological need to prove his dominance, reached into his belt and pulled out a jagged, silver-tipped spear, an artifact designed to neutralize supernatural abilities. If I can't have you, Silas snarled, his eyes fixed on Isabel, no one will. He hurled the spear. It was a blur of silver aimed straight for her chest. In that heartbeat, Isabel realized the truth. The power wasn't just in her blood. It was in her choice. She could run, she could hide behind the king, or she could stand her ground. She reached out to catch the spear, not with her hands, but with the wild, untamed energy surging through her. The spear stopped in midair, inches from her skin, suspended by a crackling barrier of golden light. Victor didn't move to stop it. He stood back, his eyes alight with a dangerous, hungry curiosity. Silas, Isabel said, her voice chillingly calm. The pack is no longer your weapon. And I am no longer your prey. The spear shattered into 1,000 shards of silver dust. Now, Isabel whispered, her eyes turning a color that looked like molten gold, leave my sight. Or I will show you what a weak wolf is truly capable of. The bloodbound turned and ran, the fear of the unknown finally overcoming their loyalty to Silas. But Silas didn't move. He stood there, trembling, realizing that his attempt to erase her had only served to awaken the nightmare he had spent years trying to suppress. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. And Isabel stood in the center of the Vampire King's den, not as a captive, but as the only person who had ever dared to stand up to the monsters of both worlds. The silence that followed the shattering of the spear was suffocating. Silas didn't flee. He stood rooted to the spot, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting between the radiant golden-eyed woman and the cold, terrifyingly still Vampire King. For a long moment the power dynamic in the room shifted. The predator was now the prey. Silas, the man who had built his entire identity on the cruelty he inflicted upon Isabel, looked smaller, grayer, and utterly hollow. With a low, guttural growl of frustration and pure, unadulterated fear, Silas backed away, his hands trembling. You're a monster, Isabel. A freak. The pack will hunt you until there's nothing left of you. He turned and sprinted out of the hall, his footsteps echoing like a dying heartbeat against the stone. Isabel's golden eyes flickered and dimmed and she collapsed. The effort of channeling the Lumina power felt like being stretched on a rack. Before she hit the cold floor, Victor was there. He didn't just catch her, he pulled her into a protective embrace, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You should not have done that," Victor murmured, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic edge of concern. "That power, it has been asleep for 1,000 years. To call upon it so recklessly is to invite the attention of things that dwell deeper in the dark than even I do." Over the next few days, the Citadel of Shadows became a surreal sanctuary. Isabel, the rejected she-wolf, was no longer a prisoner, but a ward of the Vampire King. Rumors spread like wildfire through the neighboring packs and the subterranean vampire covens. The dead girl of the Obsidian Cliffs had not only survived, she had been claimed by the Night King himself. But this sanctuary was a pressure cooker. Victor began to teach her not as a master but as a reluctant partner. He showed her the ancient archives of the Citadel, where maps of the world showed territories she had never known existed. He spoke of the Bloodlock, the reason the wolves and vampires had been at war for centuries. It wasn't just hatred, it was fear of the power she now possessed. Their interactions grew tense, charged with a strange, unspoken chemistry. Victor was fascinated by her humanity, the way she could find beauty in the cold stone of the Citadel, while Isabel found herself drawn to the profound, aching loneliness behind Victor's crimson gaze. He was a man, or a creature, who had forgotten how to live, and she was a woman who had only just begun to. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" Isabel asked one evening as they stood on a balcony overlooking the mist-choked valley. She was wearing a tunic of dark, woven silk provided by the Citadel's servants, her wolf senses sharp and alive. Victor leaned against the stone railing, his eyes fixed on the moon. "Because you are the only thing in this kingdom that is capable of change. Everything here is eternal, static, and dying. You are a wildfire. A wildfire burns everything it touches, Victor." "Perhaps," he replied, turning to face her, the moonlight casting his sharp features into deep relief. "But it also clears the way for something new to grow." The tension peaked when a messenger raven, its wings tipped with silver, arrived at the Citadel's gate. It carried a message from the Wolf Council. They were gathering. Not for an invasion but for an ultimatum. They demanded Isabel be handed over for cleansing, or they would lay siege to the forbidden territory with fire and ash. Isabel felt the weight of her choice. If she stayed, she brought war to the Citadel. If she left, she walked into the hands of those who would experiment on her, drain her and destroy her. "They're coming for me," she said, her voice tight. "You don't have to defend me, Victor. I'm a wolf. This is my burden." Victor stepped forward, his cold hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You are not a wolf, Isabel. Not anymore. You are the catalyst. And if the council wants a war, they will find that the shadows have teeth." He took her hand, and for a moment the romantic tension between them was a tangible electric wire. The barrier between captor and captive had dissolved completely. She wasn't just his ward. She was the only person in the world who didn't fear him. And he was the only one who had ever truly seen her. But as they stood there, a sudden explosion rocked the base of the Citadel. The wolves had arrived. Silas was back, but this time he wasn't alone. He had brought the shaman of the pack, a creature who knew the old ways of binding blood. The air turned foul, and the very foundations of the Citadel began to groan. The rising tension had reached its breaking point. The masquerade was over. The war for the future was beginning. Isabel felt the Lumina power surging within her again, not as a defensive barrier but as a weapon. She wasn't just going to survive this, she was going to reshape the map of the world. The explosion didn't just rattle the foundations of the Citadel. It tore through the ancient protective wards that had kept the forbidden territory isolated for centuries. Isabel was thrown backward by the concussive force, the stone floor beneath her feet spider-webbing with cracks. Through the thick, swirling smoke she saw them. The pack shamans, robed in animal pelts and etched with bioluminescent markings that burned with a sickly sweet violet light. They weren't here to kill her. They were here to harvest her. Victor moved with the speed of a dying star, his blade carving through the air, but the shamans had prepared for him. They chanted in a guttural archaic tongue, and silver chains manifested from the very air, binding the vampire king to the floor. The metal sizzled against his vampiric skin, forcing him to his knees. "You don't understand, King of Shadows," the lead shaman hissed, his eyes hidden behind a bone mask. "The girl is not a bridge. She is the key to the Void Seal. Her blood is the only thing that can reopen the gates to the underworld and grant our pack dominion over the living and the dead." Isabel stood in the center of the hall, her heart hammering. The Void Seal? She had heard the term only once. In a nursery rhyme her mother had whispered before she died. It was a myth. A warning about the end of the world. She looked at Victor, his face contorted in agony as the silver chains tightened. He wasn't looking at the shamans. He was looking at her, his crimson eyes filled with a desperate, burning intensity. "Isabel, don't listen to them. It's a lie. They want to use you to break the reality between worlds." But the shaman stepped forward, pulling a jagged obsidian dagger from his robes. "A lie. Look at her, vampire. Look at the gold in her eyes. It isn't just magic. It's a prison." The shaman lunged, but instead of stabbing her, he pressed the blade against his own palm, letting his blood drip onto the floor. As the dark ichor touched the stone, Isabel felt a sudden, sickening sensation, as if a part of her soul was being pulled outward, like a thread being unspooled from a spool. Her vision shifted. The citadel, the wolves, the fighting, it all blurred into a tapestry of glowing threads. She saw the history of her bloodline. She saw that she wasn't a rejected she-wolf. She was the last descendant of the Watchers, a line of beings tasked with keeping the two supernatural kingdoms in balance. Her weakness in the pack had been the result of her power being suppressed by a spell placed on her at birth by the very council that Silas served. "You were never weak, Isabel," the shaman cackled, his voice echoing in her mind. "You were just being contained. And now the lid is coming off." She realized then the terrifying truth that shifted the entire direction of the story. Victor hadn't just found her. He had been waiting for her, not as a guardian, but as the one who was meant to restore the balance he had lost. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Her feelings for him, his obsession with her, were all part of a deeper, ancient tether. They were two halves of an equation that had been missing for a millennium. The stakes shifted from survival to something much larger. If she let the shamans complete the ritual, the boundaries between the living and the dead would collapse. If she fought back, she might be forced to unleash a power that could potentially destroy the very man she was starting to fall in love with. "Choose, Isabel," the shaman roared, his hand gripping her shoulder. "The throne of the world or the death of your king." Isabel looked at Victor. He wasn't struggling against the chains anymore. He was watching her, waiting, his expression one of profound, terrifying trust. He was willing to die to keep the world whole. The betrayal of the pack, the coldness of the vampire king, the prophecy, it all coalesced into a single crystalline truth. She wasn't a victim of her blood, she was its master. With a scream that shattered every window in the citadel, Isabel didn't just resist the ritual. She inverted it. She took the threads of power the shaman had unleashed and instead of letting them open the void, she pulled them into her own core, turning her body into a living anchor. The backlash was catastrophic. The shamans were vaporized in a flash of blinding white light, and the silver chains binding Victor disintegrated into dust. But the cost was high. Isabel fell to her knees, her body glowing with a restless, unstable energy. She had stopped the end of the world, but in doing so she had fundamentally changed the nature of her existence. She was no longer just a wolf. She was something the world hadn't seen in an age. She looked up at Victor. He was free, his eyes wide, his hands hovering inches from her, afraid to touch the woman who was now crackling with enough power to level a mountain. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in centuries. "What have you done?" "I've stopped them," she said, her voice sounding like 1,000 whispers at once. "But I think I've broken the seal." The midpoint revelation was clear. The war wasn't ending. It was only just beginning, and she was now the most dangerous thing in existence. The echo of Isabel's scream still vibrated in the marrow of her bones, but it was replaced by a hollow, terrifying silence. The Citadel of Shadows was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin. The shaman's ritual had backfired, but the energy hadn't simply dissipated. It had surged into Isabel, turning her into a living conduit of raw, volatile void energy. Victor reached out, his fingers grazing her shoulder, but as soon as they touched, a crackle of violet lightning arched between them, throwing him backward against the wall. He groaned, clutching his chest, his vampiric skin searing where the energy had touched him. "Don't," Isabel gasped, her voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "Victor, stay away. I'm losing control." She looked down at her hands. The golden hue that had once been warm and comforting was now pulsing with a jagged, bruised violet light. Shadows were creeping up her arms like living ink. She wasn't just a werewolf anymore. She was becoming a breach in reality itself. Outside the citadel, the world began to weep. The sky above the forbidden territory split open, a jagged tear in the fabric of the atmosphere. From that rift, whispers began to pour down, ancient, hungry voices from the void that had been locked away before the first wolf ever howled or the first vampire ever rose. They were calling to her, coaxing her to let go, to surrender her consciousness and become the vessel that would bring the end of all things. "Isabel, listen to me," Victor shouted from across the hall, his voice desperate. He was bleeding, black viscous blood that defied the laws of his kind. "You are the anchor. If you let those voices in, you'll never come back. Fight them." "I can't," she sobbed, clutching her head. The pain was absolute. Every memory of her life, her mother's face, the cruelty of Silas, the way Victor looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, was being shredded. "They're too loud, Victor. They want everything." Then the true darkness arrived. Silas Thorne stepped over the charred remains of the shamans, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. He had survived the blast, shielded by a dark artifact, and he held a shimmering, crystalline mirror, the soul siphon. "I knew it," Silas sneered, his eyes wide with a manic, obsessive gleam. "I knew the prophecy would make you something worthy of harvesting. You're not a queen, Isabel. You're a battery." He raised the mirror. It pulsed with a cold, hungry gravity. "Silas, no." Victor lunged, but the void energy surrounding Isabel acted as a defense mechanism, throwing up a wall of force that pinned him to the ground. "Look at her, vampire." Silas laughed. "She's already halfway to the void. One touch of this mirror and I'll strip the power from her bones. I'll be the alpha of everything. I'll command the dead and the living. And Isabel? She'll be a husk, a forgotten memory of a girl who couldn't even survive a cliff fall." Isabel felt the pull of the mirror. It was colder than the grave, deeper than the ocean. It promised her silence. It promised her that the pain of betrayal, of rejection, of being the weak link in a pack that hated her, would finally stop. The voices in her head grew louder, a chorus of seductive, hollow promises. "Given little wolf. Let us take the burden. Let us sleep." She looked at Victor one last time. He was struggling, his nails digging into the stone floor, his eyes fixed on her with such raw, agonizing love that it felt like a physical blow to her heart. He wasn't looking at the power. He wasn't looking at the void. He was looking at her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice failing. She slumped forward, the violet light in her eyes dimming to a lifeless gray. Silas stepped closer, his teeth bared in a grin of pure, unadulterated victory. He moved the mirror toward her face, the glass hungry for her soul. "Goodbye, Isabel," he whispered. The citadel went pitch black. The rift in the sky widened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The darkest hour had truly arrived. The hero was broken, the villain was ascendant, and the light of the world seemed destined to be swallowed by the very shadow that had birthed it. Isabel's soul felt like a candle being pinched out by a cold, invisible hand. There was no hope left, only the encroaching, endless night. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the hungry hum of the soul siphon. Silas lowered the mirror, his face twisted in a mask of triumph as he waited for the light to drain from Isabel's eyes. But as the crystalline surface of the mirror touched her skin, something impossible happened. The glass didn't siphon her soul. It shattered. It wasn't a clean break. The crystal erupted, sending jagged shards whistling through the air like shrapnel. Silas shrieked as a razor-edged fragment sliced across his cheek, but his shock was nothing compared to the sight of Isabel. She didn't fall. Instead, she stood, her head lifting slowly. The gray, lifeless fog in her eyes didn't vanish. It was burned away by a sudden, piercing flare of pure, untainted light. She hadn't been defeated by the void. She had looked into the heart of it and realized it was nothing more than an empty, aching hunger. And she knew that hunger. She had lived with it her entire life as a rejected wolf, starving for belonging, starving for love. You think you can take my power, Silas? Isabel's voice didn't echo. It resonated, clear and cold as a winter morning. You spent your whole life trying to break me because you were terrified of what I might become. You were right to be afraid. She didn't need to scream. She simply breathed, and the violet, chaotic energy that had been tearing her apart settled into her skin like living armor. She had stopped fighting the power and started owning it. He turned to Victor. He was still pinned by the residue of the shaman's spell, his strength failing. She didn't use the void to free him. She reached out, her hand glowing with a soft, warm amber, the original lumina light, and touched the ground. The earth surged, roots of ancient stone and silver veins erupting from the citadel's foundation to crush the magical chains binding him. Victor gasped, his strength rushing back as the silver dust cleared from his lungs. He stood, his eyes locking onto hers, and in that moment he saw the transformation. She wasn't a casualty of the prophecy anymore. She was its master. Isabel, he breathed, or replacing the fear in his voice. The seal isn't broken, Victor, she said, glancing up at the sky where the rift was still pulsating. It's being held open by the greed of men who want to command death. But they forgot one thing. She looked at Silas, who was backing away, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt to ward off the encroaching light. They forgot that you can't control what you don't understand, she declared. Isabel walked toward him, and with every step the shadows in the room retreated. She wasn't just a werewolf. She was the bridge of the prophecy. She was the one who was supposed to stand between the worlds, not to separate them but to heal them. The pack is done, Silas, she said, her voice a final, crushing judgment. You betrayed your own blood for a throne made of ash. Now you'll watch it crumble. She raised her hands, and the residual energy in the room, the leftover magic of the shamans, the raw power of the void, and the ancient light of her own soul, swirled into a vortex. It wasn't an explosion. It was an implosion. It sucked the darkness out of the room, drawing it into her palms until the rift in the sky above the citadel began to shrink, stitched shut by her sheer force of will. The turning point was complete. The despair had been replaced by a terrifying, beautiful resolve. She had found her inner strength, not the strength to destroy but the strength to protect. She reunited with Victor not as a ward to a master but as an equal, her hand finding his in a grip that felt like the foundation of the world. The final confrontation was now inevitable. The pack would come, the council would demand their price. But Isabel no longer felt like a rejected girl on a cliff. She felt like a storm, and for the first time she was ready to make the world realize that the night was no longer something to fear. It was something she controlled. She walked toward the yawning maw of the abyss, her footsteps silent against the stone that had once been her prison. Silas lunged at her, his desperation manifesting as a wild, erratic rush. But Isabel didn't even look at him. She simply swiped her hand through the air, and the residual shadows in the room rose up, forming a cage of living ink that lifted him into the air, pinning him helplessly against the vaulted ceiling. You wanted to see the end of the world, Silas? Isabel's voice was cold, echoing with the authority of the ancient lines she finally understood. You wanted to command the dead? Look at what you've invited. She stood at the edge of the pit, where the dark, swirling vapors of the void clawed at her ankles. The whispers were deafening, a cacophony of lost souls demanding a vessel. Isabel didn't fight the voices, she opened herself to them. She became the mirror, the filter, and the wall. With a fierce, agonizing cry, she thrust her hands into the darkness. The citadel shuddered. A shock wave of pure, blinding white light erupted from her palms, diving into the pit like a spear of judgment. She wasn't just sealing the rift, she was rewriting the energy. She drew the chaos into her own heart, refining the raw, destructive fury of the void and transmuting it into a healing pulse that rippled outward. The ground stopped shaking. The dark vapors were sucked back into the earth, but they didn't return to the abyss. They were purified, dissipating into harmless, lingering mist. The void key in the floor shattered into fine, useless sand. Silas fell from the ceiling, landing in a heap of broken pride and defeat. He looked up, his eyes meeting Isabel's, and for the first time he saw not the girl he had cast away, but the queen who had risen from his own malice. He saw his end. The pack will come for you, Silas wheezed, his spirit finally breaking. They will never let a half-breed hybrid lead the night. They don't have to, Isabel replied, stepping over him without a second glance. As I am not their leader. I am their limit. He turned to Victor. The Vampire King stood in the center of the hall, his hand outstretched, his expression a mixture of profound relief and awe. He had spent centuries guarding a gate that only she could close, waiting for a partner he didn't realize he was praying for. It's done, Isabel breathed, her body swaying as the last of the immense power settled into her marrow. The bridge is mended. Victor crossed the floor in a heartbeat, catching her before she could hit the ground. He didn't care about the violet energy that still traced her veins or the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. He held her with a desperate, crushing intensity. You did it, he whispered against her hair, his cold skin a grounding contrast to her burning warmth. You saved us both. Around them the citadel began to stabilize. The gloom seemed to lift, the oppressive weight of centuries fading into the background. Isabel looked up into Victor's crimson eyes and saw not a king, but a man who had finally found the piece of his soul he'd been missing. The climactic resolution was a triumph of will over chaos. The traitor lay defeated, the threat to existence was extinguished, and the woman who had been cast into the dark to die had emerged as the very light that anchored the world. The morning sun didn't just touch the citadel of shadows. It flooded it with a warmth that hadn't graced these cold, ancient stones in centuries. The reconstruction of the hall had begun, but the atmosphere was far from the gloomy, oppressive silence of the past. There was a new, vibrant energy in the air, the sound of life, of purpose, and of a future finally within reach. Isabel stood on the high balcony of the citadel, watching the horizon where the forbidden territory met the lush, green expanse of the wolf pack's lands. She was no longer wearing the tattered rags of a rejected she-wolf or the dark, heavy silks of a prisoner. She wore a simple, elegant robe the color of dawn, and her movements were those of a woman who had finally found the center of her own universe. Silas Thorne was a distant, bitter memory, a man cast into exile in the furthest reaches of the Shadowlands, his name forgotten by the packs he had once tried to rule through fear. With the truth of her lineage revealed and the void sealed, the Wolf Council had been forced to reckon with their own history. They hadn't offered an apology, they weren't capable of that yet, but they had offered a truce, a permanent border between the territories that Isabel herself now guarded. You're thinking of them again, a voice said softly. Isabel turned as Victor stepped onto the balcony. He moved with the same grace as before, but the cold, predatory stillness that had defined him was gone. He looked like a man who had been woken from a long, hollow dream. He stopped beside her, his hand finding hers, their skin finally feeling like a perfect, balanced match of warmth and strength. I'm not thinking of them, Victor, Isabel replied, leaning into his side. I'm thinking of how far I had to fall to find my way here. A fall that saved 2 kingdoms, Victor reminded her, his crimson eyes softening. You didn't just close the gate, Isabel. You opened a door. The packs are talking to the covens for the first time in 1,000 years. There is talk of trade, of knowledge, of a world that doesn't demand blood as its currency. It's a start, she said, smiling. The satisfying conclusion had settled over the land like a gentle blanket. Isabel had reclaimed her power, not by becoming a conqueror, but by becoming the anchor. She was the mediator, the woman who sat at the table between 2 worlds, the queen of a shadow kingdom who refused to let the light fade. Her romantic arc with Victor, once a forbidden high-tension collision of opposites, had blossomed into an earned, profound partnership. He was her balance and she was his life. She looked down at her hands. The violet energy still hummed beneath her skin, a reminder of the void she had tamed, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like an inheritance. What happens now? She asked, looking up at him. Victor leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Now, we live, Isabel. We watch the seasons change. We protect the bridge. And we finally stop being legends so that we can be ourselves. As the sun rose higher, painting the world in gold, Isabel realized that the rejection she had suffered at the hands of her mate was the greatest gift she had ever been given. It had stripped away everything she wasn't so that she could finally become everything she was meant to be. They stood together on the edge of the world, no longer fighting the night but reigning over it. The darkness had been conquered, the trauma of the past was buried, and for the first time, Isabel felt the absolute unshakable peace of a woman who was exactly where she belonged. The future was bright, the shadows were kind, and love was the strongest power of all. I hope you loved this journey through the shadows and into the light. If this story of Isabel and Victor touched your heart, please drop a comment below with the word reclaimed to let me know you made it to the end. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're the first to hear our next epic tale. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.